This is the news in brief from the United Nations. Deadly airstrikes in Ethiopia's Tigre region have reportedly left scores of displaced people dead and halted some relief work in the affected zone. UN Children's Fund UNICEF expressed outrage on Sunday after two airstrikes were reported late last week in northwest Tigre, apparently targeting camps for internally displaced persons and refugees. It is more than a year since clashes erupted in the northern region between federal government troops and forces loyal to the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLF, creating a massive humanitarian disaster with millions facing acute hunger. UN Aid Coordination Office OCHA said that initial information indicated that one attack had targeted a camp in Dedebit town. Because of security and access issues, the number of casualties has not been verified. Despite reports that humanitarians have suspended activities in the area, OCHA stressed that some partners were continuing to operate around Dedebit amid an ongoing threat of drone strikes. Other aid partners have stopped elsewhere in the northwest because of fuel shortages, the UN office said. In a statement condemning the violence, UNICEF explained that attacks on refugee camps and other places, such as schools that host displaced children and families, may constitute a violation of international humanitarian law. Sudan's crisis can only be brought to an end through peaceful engagement by all parties. That's the message from UN negotiator Volker Perthes. It is time to end the violence and enter into a constructive process, said UN Special Representative for Sudan Perthes on Saturday, as he announced talks to bring together all key civilian and military stakeholders. The development comes after repeated mass protests across Sudan since last October, when a military takeover replaced a power-sharing agreement with civilian representatives, headed by former Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok. He resigned a week ago. The UN Rights Office OHCHR has previously expressed deep concern at the excessive use of violence against protesters who've been shot, while others have been reportedly raped or gang-raped. In a statement, Mr. Perthes explained that the UN-facilitated intra-Sudanese political process was being launched in consultation with Sudanese and international partners. Its aim is to support Sudanese stakeholders in agreeing on a way out of the current political crisis and also to agree on a sustainable path forward towards democracy and peace. To Greenland, where a new UN-endorsed report has found that for the 25th year running, its ice sheet lost more mass through summer melting than it gained back during the winter. The data from the Danish Arctic Monitoring Service, Polar Portal, shows that the early summer was cold and wet with unusually heavy and late snowfall in June, which delayed the onset of the melting season. After that, however, a heat wave at the end of July led to a considerable loss of ice. In all, the ice sheet lost around 166 billion tonnes during the 12-month period ending in August 2021. According to the Polar Portal report, which contributes to the work of the UN World Meteorological Organization, 2021 was also notable because there was rain at the top of the ice sheet at 3,200 metres rather than snow. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. The UN and partners have launched a more than $5 billion funding appeal for Afghanistan to shore up collapsing basic services there. 22 million people need assistance inside the country and 5.7 million require help beyond its borders, according to humanitarians. In Geneva, UN Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths said that $4.4 billion was needed to pay health workers and others directly, not the de facto authorities.
This is a stopgap, an absolutely essential stopgap measure that we are putting in front of the international community today. Without this being funded, there won't be a future. We need this to be done, otherwise there will be outflow, there will be suffering.
Filippo Grandi, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, also appealed for $623 million to support displaced people and host communities in 5 neighbouring countries. Without sufficient action to help Afghanistan and its neighbours now, Mr. Grandi warned that next year the amount needed could double to $10 billion. $20 billion weather and climate emergencies hit the United States last year, and 2021 was the 4th warmest year in the US on record, the UN World Meteorological Organization, WMO, said on Tuesday. The WMO is now busy crunching those findings from the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration with data from 6 other leading international weather services around the world to determine just how warm 2021 was. These include the European Union's Copernicus Earth Observation Programme, which has just announced that 2021 was the 5th warmest year on record, and that the past 7 years have been the 7 warmest on record. A week after the start of riots in Kazakhstan, the UN Rights Office, OHCHR, said on Tuesday that nearly 10,000 people remain in detention, according to the authorities. With calm returning to the country, OHCHR spokesperson Liz Throssell called for prompt and independent investigations into the unconfirmed deaths of 164 people in the protests, the majority in the main city of Almaty, and 17 or 18 law enforcement officers.
All those arrested and detained solely for exercising these rights should be released immediately. Now, of course, we have seen the damage and destruction, for example, in Almaty. We've seen the burnt-out buildings. So clearly, among these, and we don't have a breakdown of who is in detention. It is a huge number, as I say. But clearly, there will be some people who have been arrested are likely to be charged.
Ms Throssell noted that armed individuals appeared to be present during the demonstrations, which were sparked by now-reversed energy price hikes. She also urged the Kazakh authorities to grant all detainees access to a lawyer and to allow national ombudspersons to visit places of detention, to prevent any torture and ill treatment, and to monitor the situation of detainees. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. Global numbers of COVID-19 infection cases increased by 55% in the last week, the UN Health Agency said on Wednesday, while the weekly death toll was similar to the previous 7-day period. In total, the week from the 3rd to the 9th of January saw more than 15 million reported new cases of coronavirus and over 43,000 deaths. All regions reported an increase in infections except for Africa, which saw an 11% decrease. Southeast Asia registered the largest increase in cases last week, up more than 400%, followed by the Western Pacific, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Americas and Europe. Latest World Health Organization data indicates that there have been 304 million confirmed cases and over 5.4 million deaths globally. The development comes after the UN Health Agency predicted that more than half of Europe will be infected with the Omicron variant within the next 6 to 8 weeks. Amid ongoing protests in Sudan at the military takeover last October, the UN Health Agency issued an alert on Wednesday over attacks on medical professionals, patients and facilities, blaming armed forces for at least 2 of the raids. The World Health Organization, WHO, said in a statement that the attacks had happened in Khartoum and elsewhere, a tactic that was last used against protesters during an uprising against longtime ruler Omar al-Bashir 3 years ago. The WHO warned that the 2 cases reportedly involving raids on healthcare facilities by military personnel were especially worrying, considering the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and other public health threats. In one media report, witnesses said that soldiers fired tear gas into an emergency room at Khartoum Teaching Hospital that was treating injured protesters. In a statement condemning the targeted attacks, WHO Regional Director Dr. Ahmed Al-Madari described them as a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. They must stop now, he insisted. In 2021, there were 26 recorded healthcare attacks in Sudan, in which 4 people died and 38 were injured, according to WHO. Since last October, the UN agency has distributed more than 850 rapid response kits containing essential medicines and medical supplies to Khartoum and several priority states, enough to treat 1.1 million people for 3 months. Finally, he's best known as Mr. Speed after his success in car racing, but these days John Todd, who's the special envoy for road safety, wants more people to take their foot off the pedal to save lives, especially in Africa. On Wednesday, Mr. Todd made an appeal to Zimbabwe to curb crashes and lives lost, which likely amount to 7,000 a year, according to latest UN data. Worryingly, this number is expected to triple in the next 10 years unless the government takes action, as recommended in a new UN road safety review of the country conducted by UN agencies UNECE and UNECA. The special envoy, who pledged to support road safety initiatives across Africa, noted that 90% of people and goods on the continent are moved by road, which provide access to jobs, education and healthcare. At the same time, Mr. Todd warned that Africa also sees the highest road traffic fatality rate in the world, while globally there are 1.3 million road deaths a year, meaning that road traffic injuries are the number one cause of death for people aged 5 to 29. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. The guilty verdict against a Syrian intelligence official adjudged to have been behind torture and killings of detainees during the country's ongoing civil war has been widely welcomed by the UN's human rights system. High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet hailed the historic conviction of the 58-year-old defendant, identified only as Anwar R., by a German court in Koblenz on Thursday. He was convicted of crimes against humanity for killings, serious deprivation of liberty, rape, sexual assault and hostage-taking. No matter where you are or how senior you may be, if you perpetrate torture or other serious human rights violations, you will be held accountable sooner or later, at home or abroad, the UN rights chief said, describing the development as a landmark leap forward in the pursuit of truth, justice and reparations for violations perpetrated in Syria over more than a decade. After a 6-week surge, Africa's fourth pandemic wave, that's been mainly driven by the Omicron variant, is flattening, the World Health Organization (WHO) said on Thursday. The WHO said that this marked the shortest surge since the pandemic began on the continent, where total cases have exceeded 10.2 million. Recorded cases of infection show that the weekly number plateaued in the 7 days leading up to the 9th of January from the previous week. Southern Africa saw a huge increase in infections during the Omicron wave, but recorded a 14% decline in confirmed cases over the past week. And South Africa, where Omicron was first reported, saw a 9% fall in weekly infections. East and Central African regions also experienced falling numbers of cases, but North and West Africa are seeing a rise, with North Africa reporting a 121% increase this past week compared with the previous 7 days. Head of the UN Health Agency Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus has spoken out over continuing blockades on life-saving humanitarian access to Ethiopia's Tigre region. Tedros said that despite the best efforts of the World Health Organization, WHO, it has been prevented from sending medicine for basic life-saving procedures.
We're deeply concerned from WHO side. We have tried all our best, but we're blocked from sending medicines to Tigray, Ethiopia. And that's so dreadful and unimaginable during this time, 21st century, when a government is denying its own people for more than a year food and medicine and the rest to survive.
It is now more than 14 months since conflict erupted between Ethiopian federal forces and those loyal to the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. Tigray has been under siege for more than a year, Tedros told journalists from Geneva, before noting that WHO teams have been allowed to send medicines to Afar and Amhara regions. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. 13 underfunded humanitarian crises are to receive $150 million in emergency support from the United Nations. It's been announced. The cash from the Central Emergency Response Fund, or CERF, comes as the UN predicted that this year 274 million people will need humanitarian assistance, the highest number in decades. Ongoing operations receiving the most funds include those in Syria at $25 million, providing a lifeline to extremely vulnerable people there. From the UN Aid Coordinating Office, OCHA, here's spokesperson Jens Laake.
There's a continuous problem with underfunding. So this money will go to projects that will be decided by the humanitarian country team and the humanitarian coordinator in Syria, where they can plug critical gaps in the response going forward.
The remaining aid operations that are set to receive emergency funding are the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, Myanmar, Burkina Faso, Chad and Niger. Fresh funds are also set for Haiti, Lebanon, Madagascar, Kenya, Angola and Honduras. Aid operations in northern Ethiopia are on the verge of grinding to a halt amid ongoing fighting and bloodshed that's making humanitarian access impossible, the UN World Food Programme, WFP, said on Friday. Escalating clashes in Tigray have meant that no WFP aid convoys have been able to reach the regional capital, Mekele, since mid-December, it said in an update. More worrying still, stocks of nutritionally fortified food to treat malnourished women and children have now been exhausted, and the last of WFP's cereals, pulses and oil will be distributed this week. Speaking in Geneva, here's WFP spokesperson Thomson Phiri.
Because of fighting, food distributions are at an all-time low. WFP aid workers on the ground tell me that warehouses are completely empty. And in my experience, that's a very bad sign. It almost never happens.
The development follows airstrikes in Tigre, which have killed at least 108 civilians since the year began, allegedly by the Ethiopian Air Force. In Geneva, the UN Rights Office, OHCHR, condemned reported recent air attacks on camps for displaced people, a flour mill and a training college, noting that the deadliest strike so far had been on Dedibit camp on Monday the 7th of January, which has left at least 59 people dead. To Africa's Sahel region finally, where armed groups carried out more than 800 deadly attacks last year, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, has said in an appeal for help to end years of violent insecurity there. In an alert on Friday, UNHCR said that conflict in the central Sahel has forced more than 2.5 million people to flee their homes in the last decade. Most refugees in the Sahel today fled from Mali, UNHCR said, where conflict began in January 2012. A surge in violent attacks last year displaced nearly 500,000 people alone, although figures for December are still pending. UNHCR spokesperson Boris Cheshirkov said that the result of this was that the agency's aid teams and partners face mounting challenges to deliver emergency relief, including road attacks, ambushes and carjacking. As the situation deteriorates in Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, Mr. Cheshirkov said that every effort must be made to bring peace, stability and development to the region. To mount an effective response in 2022 in Burkina Faso, Niger and Mali, UNHCR requires $307 million. Daniel Johnson, UN News.